Every day we go to war again. We assume we know so much more than them before we hear what they have to say. Headline breaks and we start to hate again, calling them names again. We give our peace away. I hope they see it, 'cause I wanna see it. I hope we believe it. I wanna see the love all around you, all around you. I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around. Day by day, hope fades away, and then we know that there is pain within we cannot medicate. Learn to feel, learn to begin again, open our eyes again to see our brother's pain. I hope they see it, 'cause I wanna see it. I hope we believe it. I wanna see the love all around you, all around you. I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around. See how it lights you up. It lights you up. See how it lights you up. It lights you up. See how it lights you up. Oh, it lights you up. I wanna see the love all around you, all around you. I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around.
Well, good morning. Well, my name is Strietzel. It's great to be with you all here this morning. Shout out to all of you who are joining us live stream as well. Before I jumped in, I just want to say a quick congratulations on your move to Perry High School. I lived in Tempe for 4 years while my wife was doing grad school down there. That's where I met Pastor Ryan originally. So I know where Perry High School is, and I think it's a great place to be. Recently, I spoke at a non-denominational church that's open and affirming in the Denver area. And afterwards, I had a bunch of folks come up and say how meaningful and important that community was to them. And one young man in particular shared his story, coming out as gay, feeling shame and rejection from his church and his community there, and wrestling with what that meant for him until he found that particular community and how important and meaningful that has been for his healing and growth as a person. And so it's important work, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot of volunteers. It takes a lot of people working behind the booths for technology, speaking of technology today, but everything else from setup to tear down to the music, everything else that goes into that. So congratulations. Thanks for all the volunteer and work. It's important and it's helpful to proclaim and to gather around this grace-filled, inclusive gospel message. And so today, we continue on our sermon series. I've been following along Tech Balance, right? Technology, social media, and our relationships, and following along Pastor Ryan as he's been sharing on this sermon series. I love that idea, tech balance, because that feels like what it really is. It's how do we balance this? I mean, probably most of us have that love-hate relationship, and sometimes it borders on a hate-hate relationship. Some of us more often than others, right? But we, I think, recognize there's positive benefits of technology and there's negatives, right? I wouldn't be able to share with you all here this morning if it wasn't for technology. So there's a bonus. We just walked through COVID, which allowed us to work and allowed our kids, even though it was an adjustment for all of us parents, right? It allowed our kids to do school from home, right? It's given access to mental health. I see a therapist twice a month over my computer screen because she lives in another city than I do. We still have a long ways to go and greater access to mental health, but it helps in many of those ways. And there's also obviously negatives. And Pastor Ryan a couple weeks ago talked about the comparison trap. Like that was me. That was convicting. How often I see a photo on social media of another family on vacation, and I was like, I wish I could give my kids that, or their house, or whatever it is, right? And I wish I could do that. And so I wrestle with that comparison trap. And so we see there's pros and cons, there's positives and there's negatives. And I'm a parent of two adolescent boys. So technology and parenting is one of those issues I wrestle with. And how do we do this? And what can we allow? What can't we allow? How much time? How little time? All of that. So if you're a parent going through that, I'm right there with you. I don't have any answers. I'm just wrestling with what that means, right? So today we're going to talk about technology, social media, and your time. Time is an interesting idea, right? Because we're actually, humans for thousands of years have been keeping track of time in different ways, from the changing seasons to the stars and where they are as they go by, or in the flood of the Nile. Right? We've been keeping track of time in different ways. So speaking of time, and this idea of getting older in time, I recently turned 40. And it was one of those times in my life where I was like, oh, I can't believe I'm 40. So if you've recently watched Top Gun Maverick, you know Tom Cruise is getting up there in age, still looks pretty decent, right? I mean, he turned 61 this July, can you believe it? And so my son and I were playing around with a filter that makes you, appear, what will you look like when you're 70? It makes you old age filter. So I took a picture. Here it is, just for fun. This is what I look like at 70. So not Tom Cruise quality, unfortunately, but there you have it. So I turned 40, and I decided I'm going to take this to intentionally challenge myself to accomplish something. So I went down to Colorado Springs. Outside Colorado Springs, there's a small town called Manitou Springs, and they have what is called the Manitou Incline, right? Here's a picture of what it looks like. It's 2,744 steps straight up. Basically, it's less than a mile, and you climb 2,000 feet. So I had this image in my mind, like I'm going to get to the top, and I'm going to play Eye of the Tiger, and I'm going to, jump up and down, and sort of, do all that, and I got 2/3 of the way up, and I was lightheaded, and I was thinking, I just don't want to faint, and I had a goal in mind to get there in 45 minutes because my physical therapist said he made it in like 30 or 35 minutes. I was like, well, maybe I can make it in 40. And that time came and went by, didn't make it in 45. Eventually I made it. But it was this realization like, oh, my body doesn't act in the same ways that it did when I was 20, where I could have practically ran up that thing. Not quite, but I would have made a lot better of time. I wouldn't have felt lightheaded in the same way I did. And so there's this psychological barrier for me for 40, because my mom, I remember my mom's surprise 40th birthday party. I was 10 years old and I gathered her friends in the basement as a surprise birthday. And I remember this cake with these two hills, and there was a lot of black in it. Over the hill, and it had this little headstone, RIP. It had all this stuff. The gifts were, all of it was making fun of this idea that 40, you're over the hill, you're getting old. But in my 10-year-old brain, I translated it as that is ancient, right? I mean, think back when you're 10, 40 feels like forever. And so I crossed that. And recently, another reminder of time and aging. A friend of mine posted, how Facebook brings up your feeds, your memories, right? He posted a 2016 of our kids together. 7 years ago, right? Our kids were so small compared to where they are today, and it reminded me, man, time goes by so quick. Our oldest is going into high school this year. High school. I have a high schooler almost, which again is one of those things. You can tell I like wrestle with this. Carl Jung called it the midlife transition. Right? Now, in modern day, we often refer to it as a midlife crisis because people don't consciously go through this transition in midlife, which Carl Jung kind of dated roughly 35 to 50. You can't put a chronological date to it, but roughly that people go through. And it's a season where you reflect back on your life and your mistakes and everything else, but you also realize you're getting older and you're going to die someday. And your body doesn't act in the same ways it used to act. And so I've been wrestling with, how do I not act it out in a crisis, but intentionally move through this to a larger life, to a greater depth of who I am, right? And some people repress that, and can repress that their whole life, but oftentimes it kind of sneaks out later on in life, in their 60s, during retirement, right? Where they wrestle with their identity and who they are then. As I was preparing this sermon, I kind of went through too deep of a dive on this rabbit trail on the idea of technology and time, and what some people define as a time pressure epidemic. Time pressure epidemic. People call it different things. Timeless time, chronoscopic time, network time, instantaneous time. But it's this idea that researchers have come across where in our high-speed society, many people feel an increased pressure for time, as if time is going faster. Right now, we experience that as we age, so there's that part of it too. But most of us can probably at least have some sense that time feels like it's going faster than it used to go by. We have all these ads bombarding us. We have access to our email and social media, text message, phone calls. So many people can get Facebook Messenger. People can get a hold of us in so many different ways. Often time feels like it's going faster. Add to that, just piling on some things here. Hopefully I'm not too much of a downer right now. Stay with me. But add to that we live in a consumeristic culture where your life feels important if you're achieving something, right? I mean, how many times have you asked somebody, how's your week going? And their response is, oh, it's great. I have so much time. I've gotten everything I need to get done, and now I have time for leisure, for hiking, for fishing, for spending time here, for doing this, and yeah, it's been great, right? Like, that never happens. I mean, maybe if you're retired, that can happen, and it should happen that you have more time. But for the most part, how do people answer that question? They answer it like, oh, I'm so busy. It's crazy, but I'm getting a lot done, and it's really busy, but it's good, right? Like, we have to throw that caveat in there somehow, but it's good, right? And it makes us feel important, if we're honest, that we're achieving a lot, right? We're getting a lot done. So today, I'm talking about time. Earlier this year, I did some research reading up on nature-based cultures. I was just curious because I think at least one of the factors, there's no singular, one of the factors that contribute to the rise of anxiety and depression, I think, is a disconnection from the natural rhythms of the world, right? So how do nature-based cultures live? And I try to be careful not to romanticize that, but also say that they lived in such a way, I think we can learn some things from them. So there was one book in particular I was reading, and it quoted from another book. So, and the quote was good, and the title was this: "My name is Chellis, and I'm recovering from Western civilization." And so I thought, that's a great title. I want to read this. And so the author is a PhD in psychology. She's a psychotherapist, but done a lot of research on nature-based cultures. And she writes on the intersection of ecology and this idea of the human cost to technological progress, right? I mean, technology, again, I don't think is bad, but there is a cost. And what are the negatives and how does it form us and affect us as a human species? Well, one of the things she found is that human-based cultures, they worked on average, here it is, 15 hours a week. 15 hours a week. Now just imagine with me that everybody in the US only worked 15 hours a week. Imagine how that would shape who we are as a nation, but who we are as individuals. Imagine a world where if somebody worked 20 hours a week, you were like, dang man, like, don't be so hard on yourself, like lighten up, like don't have to work so hard. Like imagine if that was our world. How would that shape us and how would that affect our lives? I think it's an interesting concept, but we come back to reality, right? The reality is most of us work 40 to 50 hours a week, unless we're retired. I'll kind of speak to that here in a bit. But most of us work about 40 and 50 hours. So let's break this down. Just really simplistic. Say you sleep about 8 hours a day. You work about 8 hours a day, so 16 hours. And we'll throw in 2 to 4 hours for errands, meal prep, running the kids, whatever. So about 18 to 20 hours. That leaves you with 4 to 6 hours every day of what we might call free time. Plus a day a week, hopefully at least one day, we have 12 to 14 hours of free time as well. And so we could say, how do we spend work and sleep? And we could adjust those hours and tweak that and how much we spend and how much we need to work. And I think there's importance to that. But what I'm interested in today is what do we do with that free time? How do we spend the 4 to 6 hours a day and the 12 to 14 hours every week that we have that's free? What do we do with that? The Apostle Paul in the Bible, he's writing to a new church. It's this new community in Ephesus. And he writes the following. He says this, be careful how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. So do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Paul sometimes gets a bad rap. Some of his writings can feel a little judgmental or narrow, or you're just like, you're biting down into like some really small details of life here, Paul. Why do you care so much about all these things? And it hit me in a way it hadn't hit me. I was listening to a podcast, The Bible for Normal People. Great podcast. I know some of you folks here at the Well have heard of it. If you haven't, it's a great podcast to listen to. They were interviewing Rainn Wilson. And if that name sounds familiar, he played Dwight on The Office. So they were interviewing him because he wrote a book, Soul Boom, Why We Need a Spiritual Revolution. Now, he's not a Christian. He practices the Baha'i faith, right? But he did talk about Christianity in an inspiring way. And he said, a lot of Christians don't realize this or have forgotten, but when Christianity first was taking off, right after Jesus' death and resurrection, it was the first time in human history where people from different classes came together and talked and shared meals together. First time. Most of the time through history, people stayed in their classes. If you're a Roman centurion, you'd stay a Roman centurion. If you're a religious leader, you spent most of your time with religious leaders. If you were a Jewish peasant, there was kind of class system in that too. And you stayed in your little classes and sections. And this was the first time. I mean, Paul writes, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, for we're all one. And you're bringing together people from all over the socioeconomic spectrum together to share a meal. Now, we all know what it's like, probably, to plan like a 2-day holiday with 15 family members. We know what it's like to try to gather around to spend 2 days with family, extended, bring them all together, right? We know what that's like, right? So imagine that only you got little communities all over the place. So Paul is giving like really just practical, basic advice, like how do we get along? What does this look like? And he talks about discerning God's will so that we don't waste time. This idea that it was messy. The Christian movement, when it started, was really, really messy. So Paul is speaking to this and inviting people to think how they live. And what does this mean for us? 2,000 years later, right? What does it mean to discern the will of God and to spend our time intentionally? So I want to shift gears just here for the remainder of our time together and talk about this topic of spiritual formation. It's a topic I've been interested in for over a decade. In seminary, I took 4 classes specifically on spiritual formation, and it's kind of integrated into all kinds of different classes. But really, spiritual formation is this idea that even though we're a Christian, we still have this path of growth or formation. And how are we formed? Well, the reality is we're formed by everything we do, right? Your job, where you work, even the environment of your job and your interaction with your colleagues, co-workers, right? Shapes and forms you. What you watch on TV. Now, I grew up in a kind of a judgmental, narrow, religious tradition. It was like, don't watch these kinds of movies, right? But the reality is that there's some truth to being careful what we intake, what we ingest, right? What we watch and how much we watch. What you read shapes you. And most interested in, again today, what we do with our free time. So outside of sleep and work, what do we do? Where do we spend that time? And how is that time forming us? And what is it forming us into, you could say? Basically, the overarching question that I want to invite us to wrestle with today, and the overarching theme is this: how we spend our time shapes and forms us into a certain kind of person. How we spend our time shapes and forms us into a certain kind of person, especially, not all of our time, sleep and work and everything, but today, again, focusing on what do we do with that free time and how do we spend those 4 to 6 hours every day? How is that forming us? Aaron Nyquist is a worship leader. He's led worship in some of the largest churches in America, brought up evangelical. He's now a part of Episcopal Church, but he speaks to a wide range of Christian tradition all over the Christian spectrum. But he wrote this book titled The Eternal Current: How a Practice-Based Faith Can Save Us from Drowning. And in the book, he suggests that for too many, Christianity has become solely about what you believe. It's like a box. Like you get your beliefs all right and you find that box. And he argues the problem with that isn't beliefs aren't not important. Beliefs aren't important. But that when we make it about beliefs, that actually doesn't transform us and form us into love. In fact, we know some people that think they have all the right beliefs, but are jerks, right? And so he invites us to say, actually, faith is more like entering into the flow or the river of God. How we enter into that is through practices. We practice our faith. And he gives this great analogy of runner and say, imagine you decided to run a marathon, right? Imagine you decided to run 26 miles. So you went to the running store, you bought all the equipment, you got excited. You went and you bought some running books and articles and you started ingesting them. And there's these special events with these inspiring speakers. So you went to those and got all excited. Yeah. You even got on Facebook, talking about technology on a runners group, right? And got invested in there and commented and interacted and developed friends that way. The only thing you didn't do is actually practice running. Did everything else, right? What happens when you show up that day to run the marathon and for that last year you haven't actually ran? But you read all kinds of stuff and you've done all these other things. Does it help? No. All those other things are only helpful if you actually put those things into practice. And that's what he suggests for Christians. Like, it doesn't matter if we know a bunch of stuff or read a bunch of stuff. Showing up for church is a spiritual practice, but if that's it, it's sort of like saying, I want to get healthy, so once a week I'm going to eat a salad and run a lap. And when somebody asks us midweek, like, hey, what else we're doing? Like, oh, I already did that on Sunday. This coming Sunday I'll do it again, right? Is it helpful? Yes. Is it important? Yes. But it isn't going to form us in the way that we really need to be formed, because there's going to be everything else in our life throughout the week that'll form us in other ways. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So there's spiritual practices that help us. Some traditional, like prayer, meditation. Attending small groups might be another one. Reading the Bible, journaling. But there's other non-traditional spiritual practices that I think can be just as powerful. We just haven't traditionally defined them and thought of them as important spiritual practices. Practices like mindful eating, or taking mindful walks in nature, or taking the first 30 minutes of the day or the last 30 minutes of the day and reflecting on that time, or engaging in a form of music. If you play an instrument, can that be a spiritual practice? Yeah. Or reading, or sculpting, or painting, or reading poetry. I recently got interested in poetry over the last couple of years. I'm not die hard into it. I think sometimes I read poetry, honest, and I'm like, what are they saying? And poetry is hard because it forces us to slow down. So we can't like, oh, I read a chapter, I'm doing well. It's like you read a poem and then you come back. In fact, this last year, I've been a part of a group of us that we were presented with a poem, usually a short poem, not super long. And then we talk about it every week for an hour, different poems every week. And sometimes I'm like, oh, that poem is awesome. And other times I'm like, what are they saying? And yet it's interesting because as we talk and engage in that hour conversation, I always walk away with so much depth and richness in people's perspectives and what it might mean for their lives. So it can be a powerful spiritual practice. And there's a specific poet, Mary Oliver, who I've grown to be quite fond of. And she's in some ways like a nature mystic. She was very much inspired by the natural world in much of her poetry. I was listening to a podcast on Being, Kristen Tippett interviewing Mary Oliver before she passed away in early 2019. And what was interesting, and I didn't know this, but from a young age, she felt drawn that she knew she wanted to be a poet. So she gave her life to that, and she said, I'm not gonna get distracted by all these other things. I don't need a big house. I don't need a new car. I don't need all this other stuff. I don't need nice food. I just need simple food, provision, and I'm gonna give myself to spending time outside and writing poems. And the simplicity and the focus of that, I think, is often rare in our day, right? And this idea that I'm not going to get distracted by all these other things. Now, here's the reality when it comes to technology. It's useful. And sometimes it's very distracting. Are you with me, right? I mean, the number of times where I've gotten distracted. For example, came home, jumped on Facebook, started looking. And then I'm there, and my wife shows up. She comes back in and she's like, hey, honey, what have you been up to? And I'm like, coming out, and I'm like, nothing. Like literally nothing. Like I just sucked into a different world, a different space, in what I call like Facebook coma, right? Like I was just sucked in, and then I came out and I was like, I just wasted an hour. Like sometimes it's just distracting. Now, is that evil? Is it wrong? Is it super harmful? It can be sometimes. But most of the time, it's probably not. But is it helpful? And then you ask, how is it forming you? Well, probably not usually in positive ways, right? And so my question when it comes to time and this isn't, is it good or bad, but how much do we want to engage? So I want to end with some practical things. Bear with me here. So 2 practical, very pragmatic things for us. The first is this, to ask yourself, how much time in a day do you want to spend on the screen? How much time? Again, separate from work and everything else. How much of your free time do you want to spend on the screen? And this is you. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just looking at your time, your day. 2 hours, 3 hours. By the way, the average American spends over 10 hours on a screen. I mean, hours every day watching TV. So if you want to limit it, maybe it's try 2 to 3 hours. And that might seem like a lot, maybe. But just imagine you're on 30, 45 minutes checking Facebook and whatnot in the mornings. That leaves you with an hour and a half-ish at night for Facebook, social media, Instagram, and maybe a show or something. And then that leaves you, if it's 2.5 hours, it leaves you with roughly 2.5 hours of extra free time to do something else. What would you do with that time? So that's the first question. How much time in a day do you want to spend on a screen? The second question is, what practices or hobbies do you want to give your time to engage with? So reading, working on that painting, taking a walk outside, meditating or journaling. Maybe it's health. Maybe you want to get healthier. Or maybe it's talking on the phone with friends. Now, I know that's technology, but talking on the phone and relationships are important. Side note, we're going to talk about technology and your loved ones next week. but I just finished a book, The Good Life. It's a new book based off of the Harvard study, and there's a TED Talk you can watch. You may have heard of it. But the book reiterates some of the main themes, that the integral important part to a happy life isn't your health or your money, it's your relationships. And so when it comes to technology and balance, how much do we want to engage in technology? Sometimes it can draw us closer to others, and sometimes it can pull us apart from others, right? So when Paul writes, be careful on how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. So do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. In order to understand what is God leading you, like Mary Oliver says, I don't think she would have used the word, I'm discerning God's will for my life. I don't think, maybe she'd be okay with that, but she followed her passion and her desire, what she felt like was her calling. I think that gets at this, discerning what God's will, discerning what God intends for your life in this season, creating space and margins on how much you want to spend on social media and technology, and then where else do you want to put that time to develop and to enjoy other things as well. So I know it can feel a little childish or naive, like these are really simplistic things, Aaron, like come on. But the reality is over half of Americans struggle with time management and technology. It's probably increased. So I think I read a statistic that said 44% of American adults struggle with that. I think it's higher than that now. I think most of us, if we were honest, have often struggled with time management, technology, social media, whatever else, TV, right? How much time do we spend on that, right? And how do we gauge that, right? Again, not saying that's wrong or evil, but how are we shaped and formed by the time, that free time that we spend? I think that's important, and I hope that you'll wrestle with that and sit with that, and at least this week reflect upon that, how you're spending that free time. So let's go ahead and pray together. Creator, in the midst of so much noise and busyness, productivity, we pause, reminding ourselves that our lives matter, that our lives have meaning, and that how we choose to spend our time is so important. Help us to choose our time wisely, to utilize our time, especially the time that we have control of, the free time outside of work or sleep or errands or other responsibilities. When we fail, when we mess up, when we don't use our time wisely, when we use it to numb out, just help us to find grace and compassion, knowing that it's a struggle for the majority of people who live in today's world. Help us recognize that how we spend our time forms and shapes us into a certain kind of person. It helps us form habits and disciplines in our life that are positive, that lead us towards our own flourishing and the flourishing of others around us. Help us to realize that in order to run, we have to practice running. In order to be a certain kind of person, we have to put certain practices into place. We are grateful to live in a time and a place where we have free time, where we can choose how we spend our time, even though it's often a temptation to waste it or we become distracted. We recognize that we have the privilege to choose how to spend our time on other things that can benefit us and others. God, we thank you for this privilege. Help us to use this privilege wisely. Through Christ we pray.